Well, hello. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rich Barrett, and you're at Access Church. And we unfortunately are not able to be in the building today, but we can experience a great time together online. And I'm so glad that you've joined us on our YouTube channel. We had a great service planned for today because we are kicking off a new series called Future Family. We think God has some great things designed for the future of your family, and we're going to start talking about that over the next 3 weeks. And man, we were so excited. Our first crew gets at Liberty Pines Academy at 6 o'clock in the morning. Another crew shows up at 6:30 and then 7:30 and then 9:55. And all of our teams are getting ready to create great environments for you and your kids. But we had some crazy weather this morning, and we lost power several times at Liberty Pines Academy and realized we just were not going to be able to host a church service today. So instead, we're putting it online, which we've learned how to do through this whole season. And we're going to start with a song that we recorded a couple of months ago in my backyard. Some of our worship team just leading us to think about God's incredible love for us and all that God has designed for us. Because we're going to talk about a tricky subject here. We're going to talk about family. And for some of us, that brings up just a whole mixture of emotions. And it's really good to start by reminding ourselves that God has created family and God knows exactly what your family situation is and the help that you need in this series. So let's start by focusing our attention on our Heavenly Father.
Disappointing, won't leave cross, it proves it. Jesus, your love for me. Your love is the real thing. It's the real thing. It's the air I breathe. Your love has got a hold on me, and it's holding me. It is everything. Your love is the real thing. It's the real thing. It's the air I breathe. Your love has got a hold on me, and it's holding me. It is everything. It's the real thing. Your love is the real thing. It's the real thing. It's the air I breathe. It's the real thing.
Family. One word that means so much. It means unconditional love. It means a group of people that will always be in your corner, that will be cheering for you no matter what. A group of people that will never let you down. A group of people with whom you'll experience the greatest experiences you can have in life. Your greatest moments, your greatest joys, your greatest memories will be with this group of people, and you will never, ever get tired of being with your family. Or maybe not, right? Maybe family can also mean disappointment. Maybe family can also be the people that let you down, hurt you the most. See, that's the challenge as we go into this series about family. And I'm so excited about this series over the next 3 weeks. But the reality is that family, for many of us, just conjures up a lot of emotion because there is so much potential for family to be the greatest thing in our lives. But because of that, there's also so much potential for hurt, pain, and heartache to come as a result of family relationships and broken family relationships. And besides, as we tackle these next 3 weeks, what do we even have in common? I mean, family, how do you define that today? It has so many different definitions. We all live in families that don't look like the traditional family. We have blended families. You might be on their second marriage. You might be on your third marriage. You might have kids in your home that are foster kids. You might have kids that are adopted. I mean, everybody's family looks a little bit different. So what do we have in common, right? Well, we have a couple things in common. One thing that comes to mind right off the bat is, at least when it comes to our family of origin, that you didn't pick it. And I didn't pick mine, right? They say you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family. But I remember when I would have picked my friend's family. Remember that family that you wanted to live with, that they had cereal for dinner and they got to sleep in their clothes and they got to go wherever, watch whatever, do whatever. And you thought, man, it'd be so cool to be part of that family. I mean, their dad is fun and their mom is great. And you would have picked that family, right? That's one thing that we all have in common. That's why these words are so emotionally charged for us. When you say father, mother, brother, sister, these words mean so much. They're so emotionally charged because there's so much tied up in the concept of family for us. I know the other thing that's true for all of us is that no one that you're related to is as smart as you are, right? I mean, I remember coming across this realization late in elementary school. Maybe for you, it was in middle school or high school. But at some point, you came to this realization that, you could fix everybody's problems. If they would just listen to you, if they would all just sit down for 20 minutes and let you address these problems, you could be like, hey, I know your problem, You just need to listen a little bit better, and you need to just do what you're saying you're going to do, and you need to stop drinking, and you need to clean up after yourself, and you need to take a shower once in a while. Like, you could have the answer to everyone's problems if they would just sit down and listen to you for a minute, right? This is what we know, but the reality is that family is difficult. Family is challenging, and we know that God's designed family, and we know that God has something great for our family, but at the same time, like, it's not easy to just open the Bible and find a great example of a family. In fact, if you open the Bible and you start looking at the families in the Bible, some of the examples are really terrible examples. I mean, even Jesus' family, right? I mean, Joseph and Mary, they lost Jesus. They're walking back from the temple. They're like, hey, where's Jesus? I don't know. I thought you were keeping track of him. No, I thought you were keeping track of Jesus. Like, they lost the creator of the universe. How do you lose a kid that can turn water into wine? But they lost Jesus. And if you look even all the way back at the very, very first family, you see a family that here, there's no sin, right? Everything's perfect in the Garden of Eden. And yet they managed to mess it up. In that moment, Adam chose Eve over God. John Eldredge says in one of his books that in the very beginning, man chose woman over God, and he's been doing that ever since. And that's so true. That's so profound, right? That in the very beginning, when everything was perfect, we still managed to mess up. The first family managed to mess it up. And then it gets worse, because the very first homicide recorded in history is Adam and Eve's two sons, Cain killing Abel. I mean, from the very beginning, family has presented challenges. I mean, you look at David. Here's David. He's like awesome, right? He's the king of Israel. But did you know that the first civil war recorded in Israel's history was Absalom, David's son, waging war against David, the two of them going to battle, and thousands of people dying in the process? I mean, over and over through the Old Testament, you can't find a great example of a good family. You see a lot of really dysfunctional stuff. And then you come to the New Testament. And you come to the New Testament, and Jesus begins to present some ideals for family, some new ideas, really some groundbreaking things. And Paul and Peter, they write these things down, and we're going to look at these today. But as we move into this, and this is just going to be a brief version of a sermon to kick off this series for us this week. But I want us to think about this ideal that God has set up for us. But even as we look at this ideal, I want you to know that this was absolutely groundbreaking in Jesus' time. Like, it's hard for us to imagine this because we live in a time and a culture today where a lot of these ideas that I'm going to unpack today, I'm going to talk about this, and you're going to just think like, yeah, that's what my grandmother said. That's what my grandfather said. That's not new. But when Jesus said it, it was absolutely new. When Jesus said it, it was a big deal. And we're just going to pull back a little bit of this today and look at what the ideal for us is as a family. And then we're going to kind of explore a little bit of the tension of what that creates in us. Because the reality is, I don't live in the ideal family. I didn't grow up in the ideal family, and you probably didn't either. And now that we're responsible for families of our own, we're probably not creating the ideal family. So how do we get there? Or how do we at least make progress in that direction? How do we ensure that your future family and my future family are better versions of the family that God has entrusted us to lead? Okay? So we're going to look first at just a couple of quick verses here that help us understand what the New Testament ideal was for family. We're going to start with the one that we all love. It's this addressed to children. So here, Paul writes in Ephesians, he writes and he says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise." And we all love that, right? That sounds great. Yeah, children, obey your father and mother. All right, so then he goes on. Here's another one. "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord." And you say, well, wait a minute. You don't know my husband. You don't know if my husband even deserves this. Okay, don't worry. We're going to talk to husbands next. He keeps going. "Husbands, love your wives." Now, you say that's not new. Like, of course a husband would love his wife. What's so revolutionary about that? Well, you have to remember, this is in a culture when wives, when women didn't have worth. In fact, a woman was seen as just a little bit more valuable than your cattle. And the idea that you would love your wife, and by the way, this isn't the love here like emotional love, feelings love, romantic love. This is the kind of love here that says you're going to make a sacrifice for her. You're going to give something up for your wife. That this is the love that's an action verb. The love that means that it's going to cost you something to love your wife. And Paul says, love your wives. And in that culture and in that time, this was radical. This was new. But this is because of the way that Jesus talked to and treated women in his time. This is the way that Jesus elevated women and children in his day. And in doing so, Jesus did something amazing, because every culture since then that has followed the teachings of Jesus with regard to the family, women and children have fared better. And in every culture that has moved away from or resisted the teachings of Jesus with regard to women and children have done worse. And so Jesus says to the men who had all the power in the day, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Now, why would he say don't be harsh with them? Well, because you were harsh with your dog, you were harsh with your horse, and you were harsh with your wife. That's just the way you were. And Paul steps into that and says, no. There's a better way. There's a higher standard. There's a greater ideal that I'm calling to you with regard to family. Here's another one. He says, fathers, do not embitter your children or exasperate your children. That's the way I grew up learning that. Do not exasperate your children or they will become discouraged. Now, why would he say that? He would say that because we as fathers so many times, and of all the commands in the New Testament, this is the one that I have probably broken most often. And many times without meaning to, right? I say things to my kids and I mean well. I'm trying to maybe cast a high vision for their future, or I'm trying to warn them against behavior that can be destructive for them. But in doing so, I embitter or I exasperate or I frustrate my children. We forget sometimes as dads how much our words weigh, how important it is, not just what we say, but how we say it, our tone, and all that's behind that. Now, I want to say for a minute, I want you to know I took some time and I looked into the Greek behind this, and I want you to know that this does not mean that we as fathers are not allowed to embarrass our children. We're absolutely allowed to embarrass our children. In fact, I think that that's what we call an imperative here, that we as fathers it's part of our job description, right? We have to embarrass our kids. I tell my kids all the time, I don't want to embarrass you. I have to. It's just part of the job description, right? But we're not supposed to frustrate or exasperate our kids because they'll become discouraged. All right, here's another one for us. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. Now, be considerate? That doesn't seem like a very high bar. Why is that a big deal? Because the husbands are thinking, wait a minute, be considerate. Why should I be considerate of my wife? I mean, nobody was being considerate of me when they just told me that that was who I was going to marry. You know, I never had a choice in the matter. Someone just pointed her out and said, see that middle daughter of that family over there, the middle daughter, the one that nobody wants to marry, the one that nobody has any interest in? Yeah, that's the one that your parents just made an arrangement for. And there's going to be a little bit of a trade, a barter, some cattle. And in a few years, that's going to be your wife. You have no choice in the matter. And so nobody was considering me. Nobody was being considerate of my feelings. Why do all of a sudden I have to be considerate? This is the culture and the time in which Jesus and Paul, and we're going to see Peter here, are teaching and saying, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect. Treat a woman with respect. Treat your wife with respect. This was revolutionary. I cannot even get it into words what a big deal this was, that when Jesus was bringing these ideas forward, and when these ideas are being repeated by Peter and by Paul and by John, that this is a really big deal in this culture. where women and children were not honored, were not respected, and certainly no one was considerate of them. And treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you. I mean, it was in very rare exceptions that a woman would inherit anything in ancient times. And here, Peter is pointing out that our wives are not just our wives, they are our sisters. We share the same heavenly Father, that we are co-heirs. We are joint heirs with them in the kingdom of God. And so he says, they are heirs with you of the gracious gift of life. So be considerate so that nothing will hinder your prayers. All right, so there you go. That is the ideal that has been set out for us in the New Testament. That's what the New Testament family looks like. It's a family where husbands are loving their wives and sacrificing for them. It's a relationship where the wives are submitting to their husbands. It's a relationship where children are obeying their parents and fathers are not exasperating their children, right? That sounds wonderful. And it sounds really, really difficult. Here's the summary for you, okay? Husbands, love your wives and be considerate. Wives, submit to your husbands. Children, obey your parents. And fathers, don't irritate your children. Any questions? Okay. Well, this brings us to attention, right? Because there's a gap. There's a gap between this wonderful picture of what the family could be like, the ideal, and what's real. What's real in my family? Man, it's often nothing like that list. What's real in your family is probably not always like what's on that list. And yet, God has clearly said that this is the ideal. This is what a New Testament family can look like. And so we have a choice here. We have a choice where we are faced in this tension with a decision that we have to make today. And this is the decision that is in front of us as we begin this series on family. We have a decision. Are we going to continue to strive for the ideal? Or are we going to change the definitions of the terms? Are we going to redefine family in a way that just normalizes what's real? Are we going to take this experience that we're having, this subpar, less than experience of relationships, and just change the terminology, change the definition so that this is normal and stop striving for the ideal? Or are we going to recognize that there is a tension and that the tension isn't going to go away in our lifetime, but we are going to live in the tension that what's real in my life, maybe because of decisions that I've already made, it's just real. And it's not anything close to the ideal, but I can still appreciate, enjoy, and shoot for that ideal in my life and in my family. And see, this is the reality of Jesus' ministry. As you look at almost everything that Jesus did and Jesus taught, when you look at the stories of Jesus, Jesus taught and pointed toward an ideal, yet he refused to condemn those who fell short. I'll give you one easy example. You know, everybody in Jesus' time, they understood that it was against the Jewish law to commit adultery. And everybody understood what adultery meant in those days. It meant take your body and commit adultery. And Jesus came along and he said, no. I tell you that any man who looks lustfully after a woman has committed adultery in his heart. And when Jesus did that, when Jesus raised the bar on adultery, he instantly made adulterers of every man in his audience. Probably a lot of the women too. I can't speak for the women, but I can speak for the men. That when Jesus puts the bar up here, then he instantly makes everyone an adulterer. So you could say to Jesus, well, then Jesus, what are you going to do for all these adulterers? What are you going to do to all these people who've committed adultery? And Jesus would say, I'm going to forgive them. I'm going to offer them grace, and I'm going to offer them hope. You see, this was the tension that was Jesus' ministry. This was the tension that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. That Jesus taught and pointed toward an ideal, yet he refused to condemn those who fell short. In fact, he went further and said, I will pay the price for those who fall short. And so I want to just use one more example. And it's an example of divorce. And I say this not because this is going to be a teaching on divorce as much as I want it to be a teaching on the tension that exists between what Jesus teaches us about family and how Jesus teaches us about family and the grace that he offers for those of us who fall short. So if you have divorce as part of your story, I don't want you to tune out in these next few minutes, and I don't want you to feel condemned, because I want you to reflect back on that slide that we just showed, that Jesus does not condemn. He points to a higher ideal. He points to a higher standard. In other words, as the bar goes up for Jesus, as he raises the standard, he also extends grace. That as the bar, the ideal goes higher, that his grace reaches deeper. His forgiveness goes wider and broader, and he includes all of us, you and me, in that grace, in that forgiveness, in the richness of his mercy. So as we explore this, we get into this. Think about that Jesus continues to raise the bar on the ideal for our families, but he also continues to reach down to us and offer a deeper level, a richer level of grace and mercy. Okay, so here's Jesus' teaching on divorce. Matthew chapter 19. Some Pharisees came to Jesus to test him. So they're not there with good intentions. They want to trick him up. And they ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Any and every reason. Haven't you read, he replied, which these were the most well-read people of their culture. Haven't you read, little sarcasm there from Jesus, that at the beginning, now this is very important because in Jewish teaching, the earliest you could go back, the more authoritative it was. And so Jesus goes to the highest level of authority in Jewish teaching, which was the creation. He says, at the beginning, before anything was spoiled, at the very, very beginning, the way that God designed it, the way that God intended it, that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. In other words, it's not just two people that have moved in together. It's not just two people who have decided that they're going to be partners and do life alongside one another, but there's something that has actually happened here where their lives are joined in such a way that they have become one. It's not like they are 1 + 1 anymore. They are now one. And so Jesus describes this, that the two will become one. And so since they're no longer two, they're not two lives in parallel, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Let no one separate, not even Moses. Let no one separate. In other words, Jesus is saying, man, you're talking about two things that used to be separate, and now they are unone. And when the two have become one, you can't unone them. There's no separating. There's no pulling them apart. And at this point, I think that those who are questioning Jesus, they're like, whoa, that's not the answer that they were expecting. See, they were always trying to create a little bit of daylight between what Moses taught and what Jesus taught, because if they could do that, then they could invalidate Jesus' teaching. But now at this point, they've gone from trying to test Jesus or trick Jesus to being very intrigued by what Jesus has to say. And so then they ask what I think is a genuine question. They say, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? You see, in Jesus' time, if a man wanted to divorce a woman, all he had to say was, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, 3 times. And that was it. I guess that was so that if you lost your temper and you said it once, it wouldn't count. But if you said it 3 times, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, then that was it. And the woman could be sent away. And so they're saying, well, wait a minute. Why did Moses say that we have to give a wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? And Jesus gives this answer. He says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. In other words, Moses was recognizing the reality. He was recognizing what is real, but not what was ideal. Ideal, Jesus goes on to say, but it was not this way from the beginning. In the beginning, we see the ideal. In the beginning, we see one man with one woman for as long as they both shall live. And that's the ideal. And the ideal may not have been achieved. The ideal, in many cases, may not be reached. But Jesus creates a tension. And Jesus is comfortable with this tension. And I know that you and I are not comfortable with these kinds of tensions. But this is the tension that we have to get comfortable with as we move into this series, which is to say that God has created an ideal for family. God has created an ideal for our lives, for my life, for your life. There's an ideal that God has in mind. And so many times we look at that ideal and we feel shame. We feel like we don't have what it takes. We've already messed up too badly. And it's too painful to continue to look at the ideal and know that we've fallen short. And so it just seems easier for us to redefine the terms, to change the definitions. It seems easier for us to just look at what's normal and call it normal. Instead of saying, this is a broken shadow of God's great design for family. That God has something better and more wonderful. Now, listen, this is so important to us because many of us watching today are parents. And the decisions that we make about family, they don't just affect us, they affect our kids and our grandkids. Our legacy is at stake. Our children's experience of family and our grandchildren's experience of family. And many times, I've talked to so many dads in particular, friends of mine, people that I love, who have felt like they have lost their moral authority. They've lost their opportunity to call their sons and their daughters to a better way of living because they haven't met that standard themselves. And I'm here to say to you, on behalf of Jesus, that the standard is one man for one woman, for as long as they both shall live. But most of our families don't look like that. And Jesus steps into that tension with grace. You say, Jesus, which one is it? Like, are we supposed to stay married forever? Or are we allowed to just say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you? And Jesus says, there's an ideal and there's reality. And I step into the gap between the two with love and grace. You say, Jesus, what are you going to do to the people that are divorced? I mean, if that's against the design that God has for marriage, what are you going to do to the people that are divorced? And Jesus says, I'm not going to do anything to them. I'm going to do something for them. Jesus, what are you going to do for them? I'm going to die for them. I'm going to give everything for them. That is what grace and mercy looks like in the tension between the ideal and what's real. And so listen, as parents, as grandparents, as adult influencers in your broader family, I encourage you today, don't change the definition of the ideal. We're going to continue to strive for the ideal. We're going to continue to talk about the ideal. And just because you have not lived up to the ideal, listen, I have fallen down on this. Our family has fallen down on this. My family, more often than not, does not look like the ideal. But we're going to continue to strive for and shoot for and aim for the ideal because God's design is what's best. And it's because God's design is what elevates women. It's God's design that protects children in our culture and every culture. It is where Christianity has been known and these ideals have been known. That children and women have been valued and lifted up. And there is so much at stake for your family, for your children and your grandchildren. Every parent that I know that has made a mistakes. If they're honest. Now, every once in a while, I meet somebody who says, well, I have no regrets. And I think, I know your story. You should have some regrets. Listen, regret, we so often associate that with shame. And I get it. What you're saying is, I want to break free from the shame of my past. And that is what Jesus comes to offer. Jesus comes to help you break free from the shame of your past. But the regret is an important tool to learn and to say, I don't want those same mistakes for my children. And so I'm not going to change the definitions. I'm not going to reorganize the terms. I'm not going to call the normal, and I'm not going to say what's real is the ideal. Instead, I'm going to shoot for what God has designed, for what God has for you and for me, for the way that God wants us to love one another in a way that's incredibly empowering, uplifting. In fact, we're going to talk next week about what it looks like for us to empower each other. And it's just one of the simplest, most powerful questions you can ask in a marriage, in a family, in a relationship. And we're going to talk some very practical things over the next couple of weeks about what we can do. We're going to talk about how we can work on conflict in our relationships, how we can resolve that in healthy ways. And we're going to get very, very practical. But we can't go there unless we all admit that what's real, we don't want that normalized. We want to shoot for the ideal. And we're comfortable living in the tension that while none of us has achieved the ideal, it is still God's design for our family, and it's what we're going to shoot. God, thank you so much for your grace and your mercy in our lives. And we ask that you would give us the courage, God, to face full on maybe the mistakes that we've made, but to not get caught there, not to get mired there, but to move forward and look ahead with hope and expectation and anticipation for what you might do in our lives and in our family over these next few weeks. We ask all this in your name. Amen. Guys, thank you so much for joining us online this week. And if you wanted to join us in person, you can join us in person next Sunday. We'll be back at Liberty Pines Academy at 10:30 a.m. for part 2 of Future Family. And I want you to know that there's a great next step for you. It's called Starting Point. Now, Starting Point is specifically designed for folks who have maybe been away from church for a long time or are coming to church for the very first time. Starting Point is designed for folks that would consider themselves skeptical of the faith or maybe just brand new to the faith with lots and lots of questions. Starting Point is going to be offered on Zoom this semester. And so you can join us and it'll be in the evening and there'll be a whole bunch of us on Zoom talking about real life answers to adult-sized questions about faith. So if you've got questions about faith, you've never known where to go with those questions, and you just want to have honest conversations about them, Starting Point is an environment for you. I would love for you to go to accesschurch.com, click on the button that says Adults, and register today for Starting Point. We'll get you some more information. Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll see you next Sunday for part 2 of Future Family.